Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council, members of the Finance Committee, department directors, city staff, and general public in attendance. My name is Eric Schmidt, and I'm serving as the interim city manager for the city of Gresham. Thank you for joining me this afternoon for my budget update presentation. Before I dive into that presentation, I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge what's happening in our community and our state. For the last week, our state has faced devastating wildfires unlike anything we've seen in recent history. When all is said and done, the number of homes and buildings lost and number of people forced to flee their homes will dwarf any previous total in the history of Oregon. We are fortunate in our community to be spared from destruction of our homes and businesses, but it's likely all of us have at least one family member or friend who have had to evacuate, are facing the potential loss of their home, or are opening their doors to shelter those in need. A dozen of our own Gresham firefighters are scattered throughout the state, doing their best to keep the fires at bay, save lives, and save homes and businesses. I know I speak for the entire organization and our mayor and council when I say you have our profound gratitude for your service. And this is extended to those firefighters and police officers here at home, continuing to serve our residents during this crisis. There are employees in every department here at the city who are directly impacted by these wildfires, whether they have been forced to evacuate or are sheltering loved ones. These times weigh heavy on my mind, for it seems we have so much to shoulder. A global pandemic, the necessary but heavy responsibility of working to right racial injustices, and now the wildfires. In times like these, it takes courage and heart to get up every day, face the chaos, and choose to do your part to make this world a better place. And that's what I see in our employees in our community doing this day after day. Our community is opening their doors and sharing what they have with those in need. Our employees are continuing to keep the city running and serve our residents with grit and determination. I'm proud and humbled to serve alongside all of you. Thank you for your courage and thank you for your heart. With that, I'd like to transition to one of my top priorities when I took the position here as interim city manager, the city's budget. As I begin this presentation, I want to thank the mayor and city council for entrusting me to serve in this interim capacity as city manager. I also want to acknowledge and thank the budget leadership team, and specifically Sharon Monahan and Elizabeth McCann, for their time and assistance in preparing for this presentation. Both gave up a great deal of personal time to help me expand my existing knowledge and understanding of the city's budget, while also helping with budget analysis and development of a strategic path forward. As the interim city manager, I serve as the budget officer for the city. Under Oregon local budget law and as specified in the city's charter, that means I am responsible for preparing the city's annual budget. At this time of year, that also means I am tasked with initiating the development of the proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year. In addition, I am responsible for monitoring budget expenditures during the current year and notifying the governing body of any need to make budget changes within this year. Based on known and anticipated changes to resources available in the current year, and to prepare the city for the challenges of the next fiscal year, changes must be made now. We must take action to change the amount of available resources and/or choose to spend less and not use all of our appropriation authority in order to keep expenditures within the amount of available resources. Within the authority provided in the city's charter, my responsibilities also include directing and organizing all city departments and overseeing all purchasing. Today's presentation is intended to outline my plan for carrying out these duties and reducing expenditures in light of available financial resources. It's also meant to serve as the first step in a series of discussions that will culminate next week at the September 22nd Policy Development Meeting with City Council, where I will be seeking policy clarity on a few issues to inform my final budget adjustment decisions related to current fiscal year. I appreciate your patience in advance, as today's presentation contains a lot of information to absorb. In terms of outline, the presentation will cover General Fund and Police Fire Parks, or PFP, fund overview, a brief background related to fiscal year 1920 and fiscal year 2021, the General and PFP fund forecast, discussion about CARES Act funding, usage of community service fees, Police Fire Parks fund balancing, and remaining gap balancing. I will conclude my presentation with showing fiscal year 2021 department adjustments, along with a summary of next steps, which will include a policy development meeting on September 22nd regarding the next steps for CARES reimbursement, usage of our community service fees, and balancing of our Police Fire Parks fund. First, I will cover an overview of General Fund and Police Fire Parks Fund. While we are continuing to monitor the financial well-being of all funds for the city, today's presentation is focused on the General Fund and the Police Fire Parks, or PFP fund. The General Fund has associated expenses shown on the right, which are comprised of operating departments as well as internal services, most of which are represented here. These expenses are considered current service level and priorities for City Council and are included in the current adopted budget for fiscal year 2021. The PFP fund specifically covers partial operational expenses within police, fire, and parks maintenance. To account for these expenses, both funds receive revenues on an annual basis. For the General Fund, the primary sources of revenue include property taxes, business income taxes, utility license fees, marijuana taxes, amongst others. For the PFP fund, the sole revenue is the monthly $7.50 that is charged on our customers' utility bills on a bi-monthly basis, or $15 per billing cycle. With both funds each year, we also have to monitor revenues that may no longer be applicable, such as expiring grants or other funding that for its own reason is no longer applicable. Overall, if all of these things are not in balance, then additional revenue is needed in order to maintain fund stability, thus in turn maintaining current service levels to our community. When we look at the combined budgetary expenses for General Fund and the Police Fire Parks Fund, this pie chart shows a breakdown by percentage, with police and fire comprising 74% of the overall budgetary expenses. The General Fund share of internal services at 18%, planning and parks at 3% each, and community development and economic development at approximately 1% each. This next chart shows the same breakdown, but instead of percentages, shows the associated budgetary expenses for each service area in dollars. Next, I think it's important to provide a brief budget background related to fiscal year 1920 and 2021. As a starting point, let me take everybody back to April of 2019, to the Budget Committee hearing for the proposed fiscal year 1920 budget. At that meeting, I remember hearing, in my words, a wake-up call taking place when the Budget Committee saw a projected General Fund ending fund balance as of June 2020 to be just over $1 million. Knowing this number fell well below our minimum financial policies, the proposed budget ended up being approved, with the caveat that there was much work to be done on both the expense and the revenue side of the equation. With this in mind, the city manager formed the Budget Leadership Team, or BLT, in May of 2019. And during the summer and fall of 2019, a series of reductions took place, including holding many positions vacant to try and address some immediate budgetary challenges. During the winter of 2019, City Council took action on some additional revenue, and the city manager worked with the BLT during the winter and early spring to develop a proposed fiscal year 2021 budget that met minimum financial policies for the city of Gresham. In March of 2020, COVID hit the United States in full force, impacting all of our lives in ways that are still not fully realized. In April 2020, the Budget Committee met and recommended approval of the fiscal year 2021 budget, understanding that the budget document they took action on did not include budgetary impacts related to COVID. It was stated that as those impacts were more accurately determined, the city manager would update the City Council and the Finance Committee. That update is part of today's presentation. In June of this year, the City Council adopted the fiscal year 2021 budget. That month also saw significant leadership changes here at the city. With leadership reestablished with Mayor Eccles, the appointment of Councilor Jones-Dixon, and my appointment as interim city manager, the budget leadership team also re-engaged to start addressing our ongoing budget challenges. Which brings us to today. Since my appointment just over 9 weeks ago now, I have worked with the budget leadership team, but most directly with budget staff over at least 17 3+ hour work sessions to better understand the nuances of the city's budget and to thread together an explanation for how we got here from there, to identify some potential paths forward for more budgetary sustainability, and to do my best to provide a balanced, compassionate budgetary course correction for this organization. As mentioned previously, many positions were held vacant during fiscal year 1920. Those positions, shown here on this slide, ultimately ended up being eliminated in the adopted fiscal year 2021 budget. Overall, 26.8 positions were eliminated, which represented an expenditure reduction of at least $3.2 million. It's worth noting that while these positions were eliminated, the associated work did not go away in most cases, and service levels have not been adjusted. What that means is that other staff have had to absorb additional responsibilities to try and continue to meet the service needs of the community and the goals and objectives of the City Council. I will now spend a few minutes outlining the overall problem statement through the general fund and PFP fund forecast. Upon my appointment, the mayor and city council affirmed their expectation to me to address the city's budget issues head on. My response has been to look not only at our current fiscal year, but also through at least fiscal year 21-22, as we are fast approaching the time of year when budget development typically starts in earnest. While our reality right now is addressing budget challenges, while our reality right now is addressing budgetary challenges that include COVID-related impacts, I want to be clear that from a budgetary perspective, the city had ongoing structural budget issues even pre-COVID. The column on the left shows our current fiscal year 2021 adopted budget with a projected ending fund balance of $4.9 million. If you carried that balance forward to the right-hand column for fiscal year 21-22, together with projected annual revenues and current service level expenses, the modeling shows a negative ending fund balance of $2.7 million by the end of fiscal year 21-22. With our required ending fund balance of $5.2 million, that would mean we have a funding gap of at least $7.9 million to meet minimum financial policies. Taking into account the true realities, specifically the impacts related to COVID, the left-hand column shows a revised forecasted fiscal year 2021 budget, reflecting a revised beginning fund balance due to early COVID impacts, decreased revenue assumptions, and no assumed reductions for expenses, meaning we are maintaining current service levels. In this modeling, it is projected that we would end up at the end of our current fiscal year with a negative fund balance of $200,000. If you carried that balance forward to the right-hand column, together with revised projected annual revenues and current service level expenses, the modeling would show a negative ending fund balance of $8.1 million. Again, with our required ending fund balance of $5.2 million, that would mean we would have a funding gap of at least $13.3 million to meet minimum financial policies. I need to emphasize that this modeling is based on a snapshot in time, and that these numbers can fluctuate either in our favor or not. One of the things I have learned in my short tenure is that our budgeting is reliant on a range of revenues that come in at different times of the year, and that those revenues have different levels of variability. So again, these numbers are a snapshot in time and can and most likely will fluctuate as we continue to work through COVID and any other unforeseen circumstances that may present themselves to the city. One of the check-in points during any fiscal year is to determine actual ending fund balance and compare that to our budgetary assumptions. That analysis is usually completed at the end of September or early October. I am currently working with budget to finalize that analysis as soon as possible to determine how that work will further inform our budget situation. I also want to emphasize that our required ending fund balance by adopted financial policy is 6.5% of operating budget. Our adopted financial policy goes further to recognize that we should be striving towards having an additional 6% rainy day reserve, but our current financial state is such that we have not been able to accommodate this. If we were able to, it would bring us more in alignment with best practices of other jurisdictions our size, where the recommendation is at least 15% overall. With our overall general and police fire parks funding gap through fiscal year 21-22 being $13.3 million, what I'm going to do now is walk you through my plan as the city's budget officer to address this budgetary gap through our current and upcoming fiscal year. First, I will start with CARES Act funding, followed by one-time revenue we have identified. I will then discuss the Police Fire Parks Fund gap and then talk about the remaining general fund gap. I can't emphasize enough that the first two items represent one-time revenues, meaning they are not sustainable, ongoing revenue sources that the city can rely on annually to maintain current service levels. One tool we have available to help respond to this budget crisis is resources from the Federal CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund. The Federal CARES Act had an appropriation of $139 billion, of which the state of Oregon received $1.64 billion. Multnomah County, in turn, received $28.1 million, and the city of Portland received $114.3 million. The city of Portland, in a gesture of neighborly kindness, is sharing $5 million of their direct CARES Act allocation with the cities in East Multnomah County. By population, Gresham's share of that will be around $3.94 million, which must be used for eligible expenses and spent by December 31st, 2020. The city of Gresham will be reimbursed by the city of Portland for eligible expenses, but that reimbursement will be conveyed to the city via an intergovernmental agreement. Before continuing, it is worth noting that the city is very fortunate and appreciative to the city of Portland for their fund sharing gesture. This would simply not have taken place without the singular efforts of our Government Relations Director, Eric Chambers, who worked tirelessly with the city of Portland and our East County neighbors to pull this together. Thanks to his tenacity and leveraging the strong relationships he has with our partners, this funding is a key first step in helping the city address our budgetary challenges. While federal CARES Act funding cannot be used to replace lost revenue, it can be used to support the cost of providing local services that respond to the coronavirus pandemic, including some public safety payroll costs, which could relieve some pressure on the general fund. Basically, by seeking reimbursement for some of the anticipated costs we've incurred as a result of COVID-19, we are able to get those reimbursed resources back into the funds in which they were incurred, including the general fund, which decreases the one-time hit we're experiencing as a result of the pandemic. While Gresham likely has several million dollars in qualifying CARES Act expenses beyond the $3.94 million we will receive, we've tried to strategize about how to put the resources that are available to the best possible use, helping support city service delivery and the residents we serve. For the city of Gresham, our CARES eligible expenses that we plan to submit for reimbursement to the city of Portland include public safety expenses at a little over $2.2 million, reimbursements for our small business emergency grants at $600,000, reimbursement for community support related to COVID, as well as our mandated COVID leave and additional COVID-related expenses, all of which again total $3.94 million in terms of expected reimbursement. It is our estimation that $2.3 million of that will go towards reimbursing COVID-related general fund costs incurred largely in the current fiscal year, relieving pressure on our funding gap. The other $1.6 million would reimburse eligible expenses in other funds, relieving pressure in those service areas as well. As part of next week's policy development meeting, I plan to present to Council next steps needed to secure these CARES reimbursements with an eye to creating opportunities to leverage some of the reimbursements to provide utility customer assistance, knowing that this direct aid to our struggling household and businesses will help ease their financial burden and help chart a course back to normal utility operations. With $2.3 million in reimbursed general fund expenses from CARES Act resources, our $13.3 million gap now reduces to $11 million. Next, I will discuss what has come up as part of the two most recent annual budget committee meetings, namely questions about the use of our community service fees. Briefly, the community service fees relate to our enterprise zone program, which is regulated through Oregon Revised Statute related to economic development. It was established here in Gresham in March 2006 and then renewed in April of 2016. The program requirements for our local enterprise program are covered by Resolution 3310, which amongst other things states that the community service fees are to be used for job creation and economic development for the city of Gresham. Also that the city council will make final determination of the use of the funds. We currently have approximately $2.9 million in cash balance within this fund, after accounting for the funds that were used for the COVID small business emergency grants. There is an additional $1.7 million in revenue that is anticipated to be received through this current fiscal year, but as is the case with most sources of revenue, it is still undetermined how much COVID may still impact projected revenues both current year and out years as well. Based on our research and understanding of eligible uses of these funds, I am proposing to use $1 million of the available cash in each of the two fiscal years for a total of $2.2 million. In conformance with its intended use, it would serve as one-time revenue source to cover portions of the city's commercial business and development program, including the city's small business center. This would also cover the costs associated with the city's economic development department, help offset costs associated with long-term planning and permit services, and a portion of our communications department for the services they provide to our economic development professionals. The proposed usage will be one of the policy questions discussed at next week's council policy development meeting. Summarizing our total additional one-time revenue sources, we have $2.2 million proposed to be used from the community service fees as previously mentioned. Given the city's current finances, I am also looking to utilize, as a one-time revenue source for these 2 fiscal years, a portion of the rental housing inspection fund to cover a portion of the general fund cost for our senior code inspector that is an integral part of our neighborhood enforcement team, as well as redeploying a current staff position to focus on managing the Metro Housing Bond projects instead of hiring an additional limited term position as originally planned. Between those 2 budgetary adjustments, that totals an additional $300,000. Together, they make up $2.5 million in total, which then reduces our $11 million fund gap to 8.5. Next, I would like to share some information on what I consider to be one of our most significant structural funding gaps in providing long-term sustainable services to the community. I'm speaking specifically of our Police, Fire, and Parks Fund. The Police, Fire, Parks Fund, or PFP Fund, was adopted originally as a temporary measure in December 2012 and sunset after a 17-month term. It was then replaced on a permanent basis in June 2014. The resolution called for 95% of revenue received to be distributed to public safety, i.e. police and fire, with the remaining fixed 5% for parks operations. The PFP fee was established at a rate of $7.50 per month and has not been adjusted at all since its inception, nor has it been indexed at all during the time in which it's been in effect. But noteworthy is the scope of police, fire, and park services included within that fund have remained consistent since inception. Expanding on that a bit more, we have duplicated a graph that was included as part of the proposed fiscal year 2021 budget document. If you're looking at that document, I would reference page 122. This graph shows on an annual basis the amount of expenditures that are included within the fund for police, fire, and park services. Again, the scope of services has been consistent each year, but all things being equal, the cost of those services, as is typical in businesses and our own personal households, go up each year. This line shows the amount of revenue received each year, and as mentioned previously, it has been flat since its inception, not raised nor indexed. The net result is that for each fiscal year, the PFP fund has not been balanced in terms of revenue coming in and expenditures going out. To account for that, the result has been the general fund has had to subsidize the Police, Fire, Parks Fund each year to maintain current service levels. This is simply stated, just not sustainable for the long-term financial well-being of the city, nor for the residents in which we serve. There are a few options that council can consider when balancing the Police, Fire, Parks Fund. To maintain our current service level as included within our currently adopted budget, one option would be to either raise the PFP fee approximately $7.50 per month, or find alternative new revenue sources to address the structural gap. Another option that council may consider would be to partially reduce service levels while also increasing incrementally the Police, Fire, and Parks Fund. One option shown here is to consider raising it $3.75 per month, which would generate approximately $1.9 million. The last desired option is with no adjustment to the PFP fee, nor new alternative revenue sources, the city would need to make some difficult decisions to account for the nearly $3.6 million fund deficit. It would also be my strong recommendation that council consider annual indexing of this fee going forward. The topic of Police, Fire, and Parks Fund balancing will be part of the council policy development meeting next week. Assuming the worst case scenario with no additional revenues to balance the PFP fund, this slide summarizes the respective impacts to police, fire, and parks for fiscal year 2021. With the annual PFP revenue for current fiscal year being estimated at $3.9 million, the scope of services that's currently within the police, fire, parks fund total nearly $7.5 million and are broken down here with 53% being police, 42% fire, and parks at the 5% fixed amount. To balance the fund for current fiscal year, we would need to reduce expenses in the amount of $3.6 million, with the funding gap being distributed proportionally to police, fire, and parks. If we assume that those impacts are to be effective on or about January 1, meaning 50% of the fiscal year, we would realize $1.8 million this current fiscal year. The projected full fiscal year 21-22 realization would total $4 million, for a total expenditure reduction of $5.8 million through fiscal year 21-22. That $5.8 million would then take our funding gap from $8.5 million to $2.7 million. Lastly, I will address the remaining general fund gap. For the remaining general fund gap of $2.7 million, outside of police, fire, and parks, we worked through a budget reduction exercise and additional discussions with planning, community development, economic development, and internal service departments to arrive at $1.7 million in expense reductions. The remaining $1 million of gap was then proportionately split between police, fire, and parks. This $2.7 million would then bring our budget into balance. Taking all of the above into consideration, with the assumption of no additional revenues, the following two slides summarize the budgetary adjustments that must be made to our current fiscal year budget in order to set the city on a new trajectory that will also inform the budget development process for upcoming fiscal year 21-22. My role and responsibility as the city's budget officer for the city, and the direction given to me by the mayor and council upon my appointment, was to address the city's budget challenges head on and to work as quickly as I could to come up with a course correction that would send the city in a more positive direction. I also want to be clear that while there are proposed budget adjustments across general fund and PFP related service areas, including public safety, this is by no means, repeating no means, indicative or reflective of the value of any of these departments to the city, the services they provide to the community, and certainly no reflection on the dedicated, talented staff we have throughout the city. It is simply and only a matter of budgetary limitation. It is not my desire, nor the mayor or city council's desire, to make any budgetary adjustments, certainly of this magnitude, to the budget. Without additional revenues, this chart summarizes what would be the fiscal year 2021 operating department budget adjustments. Walking across the chart, the first column identifies the department, their total starting budget, their budgetary adjustments, their adjusted budgets, and the relative percentage that those adjustments represent. Most are averaging about 5-ish%, with planning at 9.5% and community development at 14.8%. As I mentioned previously, I am working with staff to monitor all funds within the city. In planning's case, their fund health is further complicated with land use applications for new development projects seeing a downturn in activity the past fiscal year. I will be working with the planning director to evaluate and address these combined impacts, while also doing our best to maintain service delivery for this vital function of the city. Without additional revenues, this chart summarizes what would be the fiscal year 2021 internal services adjustments. Again, walking across the chart, the first column identifies the department, their total starting budget, their budgetary adjustments, their adjusted budgets, and again, the relative percentages that those adjustments represent. Aggregately, they are also averaging around 5% with a few that are just above 3%. The primary reason for those less impacted is a direct correlation to impacts they experienced as part of the fiscal year 2021 budget process. In total, the internal services adjustments total nearly $1.2 million, $528,000 of which is attributable directly to the general fund, with the balance applying to other funds within the city. Thank you again for your patience to endure this presentation. I will now wrap up my presentation with a summary and next steps. To recap the proposed actions, beginning with a $13.3 million gap, the city is fortunate to have some one-time revenue sources between the CARES Act funds totaling $2.3 million and the additional one-time revenue of $2.5 million to help bridge these two fiscal years. In the case of the community service fee usage, the city will have to earnestly work towards finding sustainable new revenues to account for these services beginning no later than fiscal year 22-23. On the expenditure side, absent any additional revenue, we would have the police fire parks rebalancing totaling $5.8 million, with the remaining $2.7 million being addressed with general fund expenditure reductions. In terms of next steps, tomorrow I will begin meetings with the department directors, and I will be seeking from them input and recommendations based on the adjusted budgets that I've shown. I will be asking for their input by week's end so I can take that input into consideration in preparation for the policy development meeting on the 22nd. We also have a finance committee meeting tomorrow evening on September 16th, and I will be gathering additional input and feedback this week in preparation for next week's meeting with council. At that meeting, I will be seeking City Council clarity and direction related to the next steps for CARES reimbursement, community service fee usage, and police fire parks balancing. Following that meeting, as the budget officer for the city, I will work towards making my final decisions for our current fiscal year 2021 adjustments, and will keep the mayor and city council informed of those decisions and the associated timing. While we have evaluated and analyzed financial projections for current and next fiscal year, my decisions will be solely applicable to current year, with the assumption that the impacts would carry through to next fiscal year. That said, as part of our upcoming annual budget development process, the City Council will certainly have the opportunity to discuss and establish any changes in service priorities for fiscal year 21-22 and beyond. Thank you again for your time this afternoon. I know this was a lot of information to absorb. A recording of this presentation, along with the PowerPoint slide deck, will be posted on the city's website under Budget and Finance tomorrow morning. I am hopeful that this presentation was beneficial in helping clearly explain not only how we got here from there, but also options that the City Council may consider, which will further inform my budget adjustment decisions for our current fiscal year. Thank you again, and I wish you all health, well-being, and safety during these incredible times. Thank you.